In this video, I want to talk about federal lands and how the government can go about getting those federal lands. So in the Constitution, the United States, and even if you don't believe me, let's just pretend for a few minutes that I'm correct. The United States are the federal lands for defense purposes. And what do they defend? The United States of America, because the Constitution is for the United States of America. And when used in a geographical sense, of means within. So we, the people within the federal lands, do some things for the common defense, general welfare, blessings of liberty, posterity, for the United States of America. So the federal lands are doing things for the non-federal lands. To be able to do those things, they have to get land to do them on. They did that in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, where it says they have a district by cession of particular states. And then a like authority over places purchased. Okay, so places purchased. So let's look at 40 U.S.C. 3112, federal jurisdiction. Exclusive jurisdiction not required. Okay, so what does that mean? Exclusive jurisdiction not required. I'm going to explain that to you. In this report, the one that I show you almost every single time I make a video. This is an inventory report over federal lands and jurisdictions on those lands. There's different ways that the federal government can get land, but it doesn't have exclusive jurisdiction on those lands. Exclusive jurisdiction. Here it says not required, but you see it uses land. It acquires. It doesn't say purchased. Whereas in the Constitution, it says they have to purchase the lands. Words matter. Don't for a second think that it doesn't matter. It matters. So if they buy lands for the purposes in the Constitution, the states have to agree not to interfere with what goes on those federal lands, because they're supposed to be used for defense purposes and to ensure the tranquility and general welfare over the entire country. That's what they're supposed to do. And that's why they have exclusive jurisdiction. That means the federal government makes the laws and the states do not. Now, any land they don't purchase for federal purposes, they get it in some other kind of way. They acquire it. So acquire would mean in any kind of way. So let's look at this. Exclusive jurisdiction not required. It is not required that the federal government obtain exclusive jurisdiction in the United States over land or an interest in land it acquires. So now let me tell you what I think that means. When the federal government purchases lands, it purchases them for defense purposes, for the defense of the entire country, the United States of America. Those lands that they purchase, the federal government purchases, becomes part of the United States. But when it has land in the United States, because the United States can only make laws for itself, the federal government can only make laws for the federal lands. And these are the laws of the lands. These are the laws of the federal lands, the dependent state that it created, which is subject to the federal government. So the military areas are a dependent state subject to the federal government. It's saying that when it acquires those lands in the United States, it's not required to have exclusive jurisdiction over those lands. Okay, so acquisition and acceptance of jurisdiction. When the head of a department, agency, or independent establishment of the government or other authorized officer of the department, agency, or independent establishment considers it desirable that individual may accept or secure from the state in which land or an interest in land that is under the immediate jurisdiction, custody, or control of the individual is situated, or control of the individual is situated. Situated means situ, S-I-T-U, or situs, S-I-T-U-S. And that means it's under a certain type of government. Consent to or cession of any jurisdiction over the land or interest not previously obtained. The individual shall indicate acceptance of jurisdiction on behalf of the government by filing a notice of acceptance with the governor of the state. So, what is this saying? I'm going to show you exactly what this is saying. Back in the day, Rockefeller, a private citizen, would purchase lands. And then he would sell the land to the government. And then, because it wasn't or was used for defense purposes, he could give up all right to the land, or he could retain some right over the land. But Rockefeller, because he's just a private citizen, cannot give the federal government more power than he has to give. Because let's look at the inventory report. I think I closed it out. I'll have to reopen it. Lands purchased for defense purposes go under Code 1, exclusive legislative jurisdiction. Now, the state can also give up jurisdiction for some certain purposes over things like the highway. That means the federal government can make laws over the federal people who are traveling on state highways. That does not mean that the federal government has the right to make laws for private citizens using their own highways inside their own states. That's not what that means. Let's skip down to number 4, Code 4. The federal government can purchase lands, and when it purchases lands it can purchase lands not according to the Constitution, but according to just whatever laws it made up. The federal government decided that it could purchase lands and have no more power over those lands than a regular person. No more power over anyone or those lands than someone who just goes out and buys a piece of land. And so when Rockefeller purchased lands and sold it to the government, Rockefeller was a private citizen. He could not give the federal government lawmaking power that he did not have. So exchange of lands, Jackson Memorial Laboratory, for the purpose of consolidating federal holdings of land within Acadia National Park, the Secretary of the Interior is authorized to accept on behalf of the United States, which is the federal government, approximately 58 acres of non-federal land within the authorized park boundaries, such land to be conveyed to the United States, which is federal government, without cost by Mr. John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Upon acceptance of title thereto, the United States, such property shall be subject to all laws and regulations applicable to the park. In exchange for the conveyance to the United States of the aforesaid property, the Secretary of the Interior is authorized to convey to Mr. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., or to such agency as he may designate, for a purpose of Jackson Memorial Laboratory, Bar Harbor, Maine, approximately 5 acres of federally owned land within the park adjacent to the laboratory property. So they did an exchange of land. And there's a whole bunch of places where it talks about Rockefeller and land. So you have to go to the Office of the Law Revision Counsel to look up the titles. And let's see. And it'll show you the places, all the places in the titles where Rockefeller's name is mentioned. And it usually has something to do with lands or buildings. Now, I'd like to point out to you that these are just private properties owned by Rockefeller, who was a private citizen, a businessman who was a private citizen, not a federal citizen of the United States, but just a private guy doing exchange or selling or buying of property from the federal government or with the federal government or to the federal government. He has no more right over those properties than you or I do. And so he cannot cede exclusive jurisdiction to the federal government without the state agreeing. And how do we know that? Because in Title 4, jurisdiction of the United States over federal areas. Okay, let's see. Forts. There's assent to purchase of lands for forts. Chapter 4, or Title 4, Chapter 4, Section 103. Assent to purchase. See, that's the way it's written in the Constitution. Purchase. Purchase means something different than acquire or receive or donate. Purchased. Like authority over places purchased. This has to do with exclusive jurisdiction, exclusive legislative jurisdiction. Now, it makes sense that when the federal government is instituted for the defense of the country, that they are the only lawmaking power of those specific lands that it purchases with the consent of the state. Because it's a military. And the president, under Article 2, Section 2, is the commander-in-chief. So he has to be able to organize, to move troops all throughout the country. He has to be able to move troops from state to state, from fort to fort, from one side of the country to the other, into the oceans or the water near the land, for defense with a C of the country, not defense with an S. That's a different word. So they can purchase these lands, and when they purchase those lands, they purchase them from the state with the state's agreement that they won't interfere with the lawmaking power. The laws that they're allowed to make are in the Constitution. They're not supposed to make any laws outside the Constitution on those lands. That's why there was a Constitution. The Constitution says, we're going to do these things. We're going to do them exactly this way. We're going to do them on the land that you agree to sell to us. And you're not going to interfere because it's a military. And we can't have 20 people trying to do military things. It doesn't work that way. The military has to have one head, one person, okay? The President of the United States is authorized to procure. Funny how they say procure and they say purchase. To the assent of the legislator of any state within which any purchase of lands has been made for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, stockyards, and other needful buildings, without such consent having been obtained. So what it's saying is the president of the federal lands is authorized to basically purchase to the assent of the legislator of any state. Lands for forts, or for the erection of, let's say for the erection of. Erection also means state, to create a state. One state, not two states, not three states, not independent states, one state. They're allowed one state inside each state. No more states after that, and no independent states. This is why the Constitution's vague, because it uses the word state very vaguely. So independent states sell lands because the independent states own the land. Independent means you're sovereign. You can't sell something you don't own. If you're not sovereign, you can't sell lands because you don't have the lands, because only sovereigns own lands. So the independent states were to sell the lands. The United States is the federal government, and the federal government is itself another state, but it's subject to the independent states, making the federal government a dependent state, with the only sovereign powers it has been given are the ones in the Constitution. All right? It promises it's going to do things exactly this way, but exactly this way is vague if you don't know what the maxims are. To create another state. Okay, and what can it do? It can do these things without asking the legislators of the state. So it has to get the land with the state's agreement, but then after, and it starts building things, creating a state on those lands, which it was allowed to do, a dependent state, which is a non-sovereign state because it's under the federal government. It's subject to the federal government, just like the federal government is subject to the independent states. The independent states are subject to the inhabitants and the settlers. The people closest to the land are the most sovereign. Okay, so the federal government is sort of sovereign, a little bit of sovereign on its federal lands, but only in relation to what it created, which are a state of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards. Now, this is the military. Forts is a military. Forts means defense with a C. This is a dependent state. It has no sovereignty. Okay? A dependent state. The military has no sovereignty, zero sovereignty. It's under the direct commands of the federal government, under the commander-in-chief, the president as commander-in-chief. It has no sovereignty, none. That's why they can't come off their federal lands and start arresting people or forcing them to get vaccines. It has no sovereignty. We created it. We allowed for its creation. The settlers and inhabitants allowed for its creation. Okay? So, let's look at... So now, exclusive jurisdiction on federal lands. The right to make the laws on the federal lands. What laws can they make? Only those in the Constitution. So the acts of Congress are not themselves laws. They're acts in how to carry out the laws in the Constitution. The Congress shall have the power to... Okay, so look, the Congress shall have the power to do these things. But if you go up to Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1, where can they do it? The federal lands. All legislative powers herein granted, and they're granted in a limited capacity. Herein granted. Only the things inside here are granted in a Congress of federal lands for military purposes. And these people, the Senate, House of Representatives, are citizens of the United States. What are citizens of the United States? Federal citizens. That's in Black's Law 9th. Okay, so let's go back to exclusive jurisdiction. Exclusive jurisdiction not required on lands not used for defense purposes. So exclusive jurisdiction is not required on the lands not used for defense purposes. So when they buy or switch or whatever property with Rockefeller, they're not acquiring them for forts most of the time. If they are, then they can ask the Senate or the legislators of the state for exclusive jurisdiction because it intends to make defense on those lands. They intend to use them for erection of forts. So when they're not erecting forts, they don't have exclusive jurisdiction. They have one of these other jurisdictions. I'm going to close some of these out now, so I'm not going to open them back up. So you can go here and you can look up all the Rockefeller land exchanges and all the different Rockefeller stuff. Now remember, Rockefeller is part of the Federal Reserve, the federal banks. Those lands that the federal banks sit on were not purchased for defense purposes, and therefore they have no exclusive legislative jurisdiction. They have some other jurisdiction, probably proprietorial, because Rockefeller bought the lands and either lent them or sold them to the federal government. So on those lands, they call them cities, bank cities or cities. They only have the same rights you and I have because they purchased them not for defense. They purchased them not for erection of forts. They purchased them to put banks on outside the Constitution. They purchased them to do things outside the Constitution. So the federal government cannot give the federal banks sovereignty that it doesn't have. The federal government does not have sovereignty, does not have power, does not have authority off the federal lands. Because off the federal lands, they're just like me and you. They're proprietors. Not for defense, they're just like me and you. Okay? Now, the states outside of the Constitution gave some lands for like national parks and stuff. And for use of the roads. And so they make some laws for those lands, but they make them with the state. Here, they make their own laws without the state, but no more than me and you have. They can't make, like, if I tell you that when you come to my house, you can park in the driveway, but you cannot park in the grass. That's my law, and I have every right to make it. If I tell you you're going to come to my house and we're going to have a barbecue, but we're not going to drink alcohol, then you better not bring alcohol to my house or I'm going to kick you out of my house. So that's proprietorial interest only. They can say what goes on in their banks that they put on these lands, or their CDC, or their IRS, or their, let's see what else they have that they don't have the right to make laws off the lands. Let's see. Anything non-positive, and even some stuff positive. Congress. They don't have the right to make laws outside of the seat of government. Domestic security, they don't have the right to come off the federal lands and do stuff to people. Agriculture, no. Alien nationality, no. Banks and banking, they have no power, they have no sovereignty, they have no jurisdiction, they have no authority off the little piece of land that they have where their banks sit. Outside of their federal buildings, not used for defense purposes, but for use for all these other things, they have no power. Commerce and trade, no power off federal lands. Because what does the Constitution say? The Constitution says these are the powers granted to the federal government on the federal lands for defense purposes. You go to Article 1, Section 8, where they have the whole list of things. Congress shall have the power to. And where do they have the power to? Where? The United States. Where are the United States? The federal lands for federal purposes, which is defense. Who do they work for? For the United States of America. This is the states. This is the federal areas inside the states. When they gave up the land to them, they said, we are only going to do these things. These things where? Article 1, Section 8. Clauses 1 through 18. And how do we know all of these things have to be and only can be done on the federal lands? Because it's one long sentence. There's the period. Everything else, there's no periods. It's one long sentence. This is the stuff that they say they're going to do on the federal lands. Who could come on the federal lands and do these things? Senators, representatives, and president who agree to become citizens of the federal lands, called citizens of the United States. You get down to the Article 3 judicial power, there is no requirement to be a citizen of the United States. Because, in my opinion, citizens of the United States are military people for military purposes, for defense. Judges are moral people. Military are not. You can't win a war being a moral person. That's why the judges are not required to be citizens of the United States. They're only required to have good behavior, moral people. They have to be people who can see beyond the military stuff. See, this is Article 3, no corruption of blood. It should not work for corruption of blood. They have to be good, decent human beings outside the military. Okay? And if they were citizens, how could they adjudicate issues between them being a citizen and another citizen? They're always going to see it in their favor because then they become part of the club. Right? So if one of my kids gets in trouble and I'm an attorney, I want to represent them because I'm always going to have everything swung in their direction because they're my kids. Okay, if I'm in a club and I'm an attorney and one of my club members get in trouble, I'm going to represent them and swing everything in their favor because I'm part of their club. We're like buddies. Same thing. Article 3 does not require judicial officers to be citizens of the United States. Okay, so back to jurisdiction. There are different types of jurisdiction. They're here. The Constitution gives one. That's exclusive. Exclusive because it's for military purposes. That's Code 1 in this inventory report. The other jurisdictions came later because, like I said in another video, everyone wants to expand themselves. Everyone wants more power. They want to get more power. They go hysterical over power. They go mad over power. Just like in the book, Ron Paul recommends it. I forget what it's called. Something extraordinary, popular delusions. And he says in there that men go mad in herds. And we've seen this recently with the masks. If you don't wear a mask, oh my gosh, the people in the grocery store, they go mad, they get hysterical because they're so afraid. On the airplane, there was a kid not wearing a mask and people on the airplane were getting hysterical. They were just going crazy, even though kids aren't even getting sick. The same thing with the judges, the same thing with the politicians. They're going mad with desire for power, desire for land, desire for authority and jurisdiction and the claim of sovereignty. And they've gotten so mad that they're absolutely just lying about things. They're just lying. They're lying directly to us. They're mad with greed and power and lust. Okay? So when they write these things, they write them in a way that's vague, and most people can't understand them. They don't explain things very well. And so you read this thing and you think, well, they can just do whatever they want to me. But that doesn't even make sense. Why would anyone in their right mind institute a government that can do whatever it wants to you? And if they did do that, then they weren't in their right minds. They were absolutely crazy. And if they were crazy, then it can't be a contract. You can't make a contract. The sane person cannot make a contract with a crazy person. Okay, so that's this video, and this was a video on jurisdiction and how the government acquires or purchases land and for what purposes they can do it. And to get exclusive jurisdiction means that they're going to use the land for military purposes. And if they're going to use the land for military purposes, they have to get the authority from the state stating that it's like a contract, which is the Constitution. It says exactly what they're going to do on the federal lands, exactly how they're going to do it, and that the states aren't going to interfere with those things because they're doing them for national defense. Okay, national defense with a C, which means fortification. That's in the law of nations. They use defense and they use to fortify, and what a good government does is to fortify. A good government helps us, defends us, keeps us safe as far as the military power goes. And a bad government does all the things that our government currently is doing right now, where they've instituted all of these corporations and they push them out onto us and tell us that we have to comply. And they say, well, it's not us, it's the media telling you this. But then they never come out and say they have no authority off federal lands. They never come out and say nobody has to use the Federal Reserve note. They never come out and say the CDC is a foundation, a nonprofit organization that nobody has to comply with. They don't come out and say that nobody off federal lands has to do the census. They don't come out and say that nobody has to get a license if you're not working for the federal government. They don't come out and say that nobody has to pay federal taxes unless they work for the federal government. They don't come out and say those things. So they're just as bad, just as guilty, and just as power hungry as the Federal Reserve banks. They don't come out and say that they have no control over education. They don't come out and say that. They want you to go and read their laws, and when you read their laws, you don't understand and you think they apply to you. And then they don't correct it. They don't correct your misunderstanding. They say, well, it's the media. It's the media. No, it's not the media. It's them. And the judges, and the way they write their opinions, they write them in such a way that they're just as confusing as the laws. Okay, so please consider liking, sharing, subscribing. Be kind to each other as we go through these difficult times, and try to share my videos as much as you can, because I'm basically kicked off all the social medias, as you can imagine. And with that, you guys have a great day.